When I was in fifth grade, I had a paper route, and then I worked construction and painting. And at 16, I got my first real job where they actually pulled out taxes. And it was at a large corporation. My dad worked there. He was upper management. He got me in the door, but I was in a completely different department. This company was called Kidnapping U.S. Wind Power. It was the organization or the corporation that ran all of the windmills on Altamont Pass. So there were about 1,000 people at this location working. And my job, I was hired under the maintenance program, and after school, as a junior in high school, I would drive there, and with 1,000 people, you probably had 25 of these little water coolers that had to be emptied and changed, and so every day I would go and check them all and change them, and then the recycling wasn't under the contract of the janitorial service, so I did all the recycling. So every day after school, I'd go there and make my rounds and do all this stuff. I was there about 1,000 people. So one of the things that struck me as having my first official job at a large corporation with 1,000 people was when I went into the maintenance department. You had a bunch of guys, blue-collar guys, and this was back in the day. At the end of the day, they have to clock out. It's 4:55, and they're waiting around doing some paperwork, and they're back there, smoking a cigarette, and on the wall there's the calendar girl that wouldn't be allowed today, that sort of stuff, right? And what struck me is the attitude that the maintenance workers had towards the management. They didn't have memes back then, but back in those days, you would take comics and Xerox them and then hang them up on the wall. Well, on the wall, there was a picture of a very tall outhouse. And it was a 2-story outhouse, and on the bottom story, there was a door to the outhouse, and it said employees. And then there were stairs going up, and there was a balcony and a second door on the outhouse, and it said management. And the expression was that the management is always dumping on the employees. Now, our manager of that department, she was a gal, and she was tough as nails. Everyone respected her. She was tough and fair and nice. But whenever one of the suits walked by, the CEO or the president or the vice president walked by or drove by, it was always grumbling. I can't believe that guy. He's driving that nice car. We're paying for it. His kid probably drives a nicer car than mine. There was just constant grumbling towards the people in suits. And it just kind of struck me. I just didn't know that there was this much animosity from the employees to the employers. But then I would come home from work, and my dad was upper management. He was one of the suits. And he would come home and he would tell me all the stuff he was dealing with, that this employee didn't pass his drug test, this employee kept showing up late, this employee showed up drunk, this employee got in a fight with another employee, this employee didn't have the proper license to drive this truck but drove it anyway, and he was constantly dealing with it. He didn't badmouth him, but it caught me off guard as a 16-year-old how much animosity there is from management to employees and from employees to management. Luckily for us, when we confess Christ as Lord and we give our lives to Him, He speaks to every area of our lives. And He has not left this area unchecked. He has spoken. He has specific words for those of you here that are an employee. He has specific instructions for you that are an employee. And He has specific instructions for those of you here who are managers of some sort. And we're going to look to His Word and see what He has to say. If you would open up to Ephesians chapter 6, we're going to be just reading a couple of short verses. We're in Ephesians chapter 6, starting with verse 5. In this passage, Paul has been addressing demographic groups. And I want you to notice that with each cluster of two, he starts with the person or people who would be considered to be lower in authority and lower in power. So he addresses wives and husbands, and then he addresses children and fathers, and in this sentence, in this section, he's going to address what I would describe as workers and as managers. Some of your translations will say bondservants, some of yours will say slaves, and we'll get into that. So he's addressing the demographics, chapter 6, starting with verse 5. This is what Paul says. Bondservants. This word is doulos. It can also say slaves. Obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not only by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or free. Verse 9, Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. The big idea of this entire section is that God, or that Paul and the Lord through Paul, wants to see healthy and godly families. You might say, well, what does employer and employees have to do with families? Well, typically in this era, your house and your place of work was the same. And so workers and employees would be part of the household. He's saying, I want godly, healthy, functioning families in the church so that we can spread the gospel. So the first thing I want to look at, and you can follow along the notes in your bulletin if you're the type that likes to see the verses and kind of understand where I'm going. What we've got to do is we've got to contextualize this biblical account, meaning that there is a massive gulf, a massive gap in our understanding of ancient world slavery. That when we say this word slavery, that means something to us, but it's not the same meaning to them. We are separated by 7,500 miles, 300 years, 3,000 years of history, different cultures and different languages. And what we tend to do is we take our American 21st century lenses and we view the text through those lenses, and then we come to conclusions that are false. So we have to remove those lenses and try to understand it from a first century perspective. So the second thing is that our concept of slavery is not their concept of slavery. When we hear as Americans the word slavery, we think of African chattel slavery. The slavery that occurred during the colonial era and early American history is what historians call chattel slavery, meaning that the slaves were treated like animals. It is estimated that about 600,000 people were kidnapped in Africa, taken to the coast, and then sold to Europeans and brought over to the Americas during that time. And if you were in school, you will probably remember the picture of that ship, the Brooks, and it had a layout of the ship and how you could fit 472 slaves packed in there, and it was to demonstrate how bad the conditions were. And so in American chattel slavery, the slaves were purposely uneducated. They were primarily just workers. There was no chance for freedom. There was no chance for education or a better life, and free slaves were still subject to racism because they couldn't go back to Africa because they weren't born there and they didn't speak the language, and yet they couldn't be here as well. And also, the slaves looked different from the culture. You could tell right away who was a slave and who wasn't by the color of their skin. So as Americans, we hear this word slave or slavery, and this sort of chattel slavery is what pops into our minds. But what's going on in the ancient world is very, very different from the chattel slavery that we think about. Slavery in Rome was very different. First, it was not racially restricted. You could walk down the street and you wouldn't know who was a slave and not a slave because everyone looked about the same. The second thing is that slaves were about as common as cars. And I mean this truly. That even financially poor people in our country own cars. In Rome, even the poorest families had a slave. It is estimated that about 1/3 of the entire Roman Empire were slaves. 1 out of every 3 people you saw walking down the street was a slave. And so we have this word, doulos. It's the word that's translated as bondservant or slave in your text. But the semantic range of this word is wide. What I mean is the word doulos can mean a great many things, but the word slave in our language is very small. It means only one thing. So it's trying to translate a very wide word and cram it into a small word. And that's one of the problems that we have here. Ancient world slavery was similar to military life. I almost said married life, see? Military life. In military life, you show up, you say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am. They tell you where to sleep. You have to put on a uniform. You have a task. They can transfer you to different departments. You're kind of owned by the military, and yet they still have to feed you and clothe you and train you and take care of you. And you can have a wife, and you can have kids, and you can have a family. And that's how generally ancient world slavery was. There were also highly educated slaves. For instance, in Rome, you could hire a slave as a manager of your estate. Let's say you were a very wealthy man, you owned properties everywhere, and you had lots of money. You could hire a slave who was the equivalent of a CEO, and it would cost you in today's dollars $500,000, 500 grand to hire a manager to manage your company. And he was a slave, but he was white collar, he was smart, he was educated, he knew his stuff, and he knew how to manage your company. On the lower end, you could buy a 10-year-old boy as a slave for about $7,000. And you would train the kid up, and he would become the house slave, probably a housekeeper. Slavery was not even the lowest economic position in Rome. To be a day laborer, someone who just had a regular day job, was actually worse. Because as a slave, your owners had to feed you and house you and care for you. But as a day laborer, you could starve on the street. So the summary here in ancient Rome is that slave treatment varied. Slaves could earn their freedom. They looked similar to the population. Slaves could be educated. Sometimes they willingly stayed with their masters. Slaves were highly sought after managers, and day laborers could be considered lower than slaves. So when Paul says, slaves, obey your masters, understand, he's not talking about chattel slaves. He's talking about a type of indentured servants, and that's why some of your translations say bond servants. This brings up a second issue that we have to deal with before we even get to the text, and that is some of the slings and arrows that are often thrown or shot at us Christians based upon this issue of slavery. There are some uneducated arguments that come our way. And when I say uneducated, I don't mean to be insulting. I just mean that people literally have not read the text, but they've heard things. For instance, in Exodus 21, it says, when you buy a Hebrew slave. Or what about Exodus 21:7? When a man sells his daughter as a slave. You take these verses and you say, see, I knew it. I knew you Christians. Pro-slavery. All of this stuff happened in the ancient world during American chattel slavery. It was because of the Christians, because the Bible is pro-slavery, and if you believe this stuff, then you're part of the problem. The problem is that these arguments are so easily dismantled by just looking at the text. The first thing we find is in Exodus 21:16, we find that kidnapping was punishable by death, and if you possessed a kidnapped person, you could be punished by death. So what this means is, right off the bat, what happened in colonialism was against the Scripture. So an African slave or an African kidnaps an African, brings them to the coast. That would have been a capital punishment. And then you, as a European, if you were following the Scripture, when you bought this person, that would have been a capital punishment as well, because you have in your possession a kidnapped person. And so you were not allowed to kidnap anyone or hold a kidnapped person, punishable by death. And so that's the first thing we need to know. The second thing is that in the Old Testament, slavery was an alternative to jail or debt. There were no prisons in ancient Israel. Now I want you to imagine this. You're having a really bad day. You go to Walmart. You get yelled at for not having on a mask. Someone cuts you off in the parking lot. And then you see some guy yelling at a poor cashier, some 17-year-old girl, and some guy's yelling at her about a mask. And you're like, hey, buddy, calm down. He gets in your face. There's a fight. And because you're way tougher, you punch him in the face. You knock out a bunch of his teeth. He falls over. He hits his head. And now he's got a major medical injury. And you're in jail. And you're in jail for 3 years. You have to blow all this money on lawyers, and it's this long process. You're in jail for 3 years, and of course, you can get that sentence cut in half, so you're actually in jail for 1.5 years. Well, what happens when you're in jail for 1.5 years, and you have a wife and kids at home? Well, you blew all your money on lawyers. You're probably going to lose your home. Your family's going to be cast into poverty. You're not going to see your kids in any meaningful way for a year and a half. What's going to happen? They're going to have to move in with your parents or her parents or something. It's a mess. And so I would ask you this question. Would you rather go to prison for a year and a half, or would you rather go into indentured servanthood? Where the family of the guy whose teeth you punched out, you have to go work for them. You have to go work for them as a, quote, slave. And guess what, though? You get to come home at night and be with your wife and your kids and maybe save your house. And there's no jail time. And so this was what happened in the ancient world. You commit a crime or something like that, there's no prisons. You might become an indentured servant, also a slave to a family or person. But here's the other thing. There were strong limitations on slavery. You could not rule over them harshly. You could not work them on the Sabbath. And slavery was only for a time. In the Hebrew culture, you could only be a slave for 6 years, and then you had to release the person. On top of that, if you were a slave and you ran away, guess what? They had no recourse. So if you ran from this town to another town, they couldn't come and get you and bring you back. It was over. So as far as I'm concerned, if it's for a limited duration and you can run away and leave the slavery position anytime you want, that's not really slavery. It was a system put in place to protect people, but also to provide people with work. And there were some people who were willing slaves that said, I love this family. They take care of me. They take care of my wife and my kids. I'm going to become a slave of this family. And it was very, very common. Paul also told slaves in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, if you have the opportunity to get your freedom, get it. All this to say, the Bible does not endorse slavery in any way, shape, or form, and it's a ridiculous argument based upon verses taken out of context and the ignoring of many other verses. So the summary is the Old Testament system was a willing indentured servitude with very strict and humanitarian regulations, nothing like chattel slavery. Slavery was widespread during the time of Jesus. Paul did not endorse it. Paul instructed Christians to gain their freedom if they could, and he even tried to free a slave. I felt like we needed to unpack all this before we get into our verse because there's so much culture that has to be unwrapped here. So if we look at chapter 6, starting with verse 5, he addresses slaves or bondservants, and I'm going to assume in our culture he's talking about employees. Because we don't have indentured servants, we don't have slavery, we don't have chattel slavery. The closest thing that we have to the principles brought forth in this passage would be employees. It could be if you're in school and you have a teacher and someone's above you. It could be in the military where you're an enlisted man or woman and there's an officer above you. So I'm going to start off talking about employees. And so if you are an employee in any form here today, whether it's military or whether it's a regular employee, this message is for you. The first thing he says in chapter 6, verse 5, is he says, I want you to obey your masters, and in our context, your bosses. I want you to obey your managers with fear and trembling. Now, what does that mean? Paul uses that specific language a couple of times throughout the New Testament, and what he's saying is that this needs to be taken seriously, that there will be consequences for your conduct. There will be consequences for how you conduct yourself as an employee of a company. Now, obviously, you could be fired, but it could be worse than that because you could be fired, and then the reputation among the local city or area is that you're a bad employee. And so if you work in this industry and you get fired, not only are you going to lose your job, but you try to apply at a different company of the same industry, and they've already heard about you, and they're not going to hire you either way. Back then, there was no Social Security. There was no unemployment. If you lost your job, you could be in trouble. People starved to death. He's saying, employees, I want you to take this seriously. Then he goes on to say in verse 5 that I want you to obey your employer or those above you with a sincere heart. Do you know what the most stolen commodity on earth is? It's time. Men and women who are paid to do a job and then don't do it. And they're stealing time from their employers. Now, I'm not talking about, some work is kind of off and on. Like if you're digging a ditch, you might dig for 5 minutes and then you take, you lean on the shovel, you take a break for a couple. I'm not talking about that. In some jobs, there is downtime and you're allowed to read a book or look at your Facebook or whatever it might be. But generally speaking, he's saying, Christian employees, I want you guys to work with a sincere heart. I want you to put your heart into it. I don't want you to, I'm going to go stupid work again, dragging your feet in, being the complainer. I want you to put your heart into your work. And you might say, you don't know my boss. She's a jerk, or he mistreats me, or my job is stupid and pointless. Well, he addresses this in the next passage. He says, obey with a sincere heart, and I want you to work as you would work for the Messiah. I want you to imagine that Jesus himself has placed you in this position, and Jesus himself is your boss, and you're working for him. Now, I know you will tell me stories about bosses that are incompetent. You will tell me stories about bosses who are jerks, about bosses who micromanage, or bosses who don't manage at all, and they just throw you out there with no direction. And I've worked for bosses like that before. I've worked for pastors who were completely incompetent, and I'm not trying to, I just, in a literal sense, they did not know how to do their job. I worked for a pastor once who told his staff, I don't like being a pastor. I don't even want to be here. It's just that I'm too old. No one will hire me. And so I'm writing out my retirement. And he was downloading his sermons from the internet and just recycling them. And he told us that. And I didn't like working for him, and I knew the church wouldn't go anywhere under his leadership. And so we've all had to deal with, I hate to say it, boss holes. But what are we going to do? Paul says, work for that boss as you would work for Jesus with a sincere heart. Now, I don't know if you've heard of Navy SEAL Jocko Willenick. He writes and speaks on leadership. And he has a podcast and a show, and people will call in and ask him questions. He's not a Christian that I know of, but someone called in and said, okay, what do I do? Leadership theory. What do I do when I have a boss who's an egomaniac, a boss who's incompetent, a boss who's a jerk, whatever it is, you name it. And what he says is anti-intuitive. He says, you, as an employee, you do everything you can to lift that boss up and make them look good. He says this comes down to ego, because you as an employee, you know more than your boss, you're more competent than your boss, you know your boss is a hypocrite, and what you want to do is you want everyone else to see it. You want everyone in the company to see that this guy's an idiot and you're way better and you can do the job better than he can or she can. But the problem is, you're not the boss. And no one's going to care. And all you're going to do is, however bad the situation is, you're going to further its disintegration. So what good does it do to badmouth, to gossip about, to tear down, to contradict, to complain to a boss who isn't very good? It doesn't do any good. What it does is, however bad it is, it makes it worse, it halts productivity, and it destroys the team. And at the end of it, since you're not in charge and he or she is, you're going to be the one to look like the jerk. And ultimately, they're going to get rid of you. So he says, put your ego in check. So what I would say is that if you're working under a boss like this, recognize this is who he or she is. They're probably not going to change. And to ask yourself this question, can you live with it? You're getting paid. They're paying you by the hour or salary or whatever it might be. Can you live with this person knowing they're probably not going to change? And if you can't, then get out of there. If you can, make it work. But the worst thing that you can do is stay and cause problems. This happens in churches as well, where you're at a church and you're having problems with the pastor or the associate pastor or this elder or this deacon. And at a certain point, you have to decide, am I going to stay and gossip and cause trouble and make a big mess? It's either you got to stick through it and say, okay, This is who he is. I'm going to work with him or I'm going to leave. But to stay and cause trouble is probably the worst decision because it affects everybody. So he says, I want you to do this, employees, with fear and trembling. Do it with a sincere heart and obey this person. Work for this person as if he or she were Jesus. And then in verse 6, he says, I want you to do it, depending on your translation, I don't want you to work only in appearance. It's easy for us to pretend like we're working and we're not. You know, the boss comes by and you quickly minimize Facebook and you throw back up the other thing you're supposed to be working on. About 15 years ago, I was doing open water rescue for the East Bay Regional Fire Department. It's kind of a glorified lifeguarding situation. And we would get up, there's this big lake, there's 3,000 people in the water, 10,000 people on land, 13,000 people. We would have these lifeguard structures that were built up about 8 feet tall, and you would sit up there on a chair so you could see all of the water, and you had a microphone, and you could be like, hey, you stop that, and look and see if anyone's drowning. That was our job. We had to watch the water. Well, there were 3 towers, and all the towers overlapped the water they watched. So the person in the middle had people on the right and the left watching his or her water. Well, one of the problems with lifeguarding is that it's 2 p.m, it's July, you just ate lunch, it's hot, there's ambient noise, and people tend to fall asleep in these chairs. And so the fire department did lots of training, different things, rotating stimuli to keep people from falling asleep. Well, some of the employees and middle management came up with a really great solution. They decided to have the middle chair be the sleep chair. We had all of the equipment that EMTs had. We had spine boards and oxygen, and we also had neck braces. So it was known that when you got to sit, when we rotated and you rotated in this chair, you would go up there, you would take the neck brace, and you would put it on, and then put your sweatshirt on over it, sit in the chair with your glasses on, and then you could sleep and you wouldn't nod off because you had the neck brace on. So they actually did this, and the lifeguards in this tower and on this tower, they would watch the middle. And so it was a sleep station. So here's a guy up there with a neck brace on, pretending to watch the water, all the while sleeping. It was really, really stupid. Now, this happened before I got there. I heard about it. But apparently the upper management found out and some heads rolled, and that was the end of that. But it's this idea of, I'm just going to pretend like I'm working, but I'm not actually going to work. Paul says, don't do that, don't do that. And then he summarizes it. In verse 7, he says, I want you to render service with goodwill. And it reminds me of Proverbs 22:29, and it says, do you see a man skillful in his work? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before obscure men. In other words, if you do your work and you put your heart into it and you do the best job that you can, your boss right now may not recognize it. But the big picture is you will eventually be recognized and you will move forward, move ahead, move up into better jobs, better pay if you are working as unto the Lord. One of the complaints that I hear from a lot of employees, which I have a unique perspective because most of my career I have spent having multiple jobs, where one job I'm white collar management and another job I'm blue collar being managed. But one of the complaints I often hear is a frustration with why I can't get better pay, why I'm not getting promoted, why I can't get a better job. And what I want to say to people, and I have to say this to myself, is how often do you reflect upon your own employment? Do you think maybe there's a reason why you keep getting passed up for promotions? Do you think maybe there's a reason why you're not progressing in your career? And these are the sorts of questions that people don't want to ask themselves. Maybe it's because you have a bad attitude. Maybe you complain. Maybe you show up late, leave early, take long lunches. Maybe you exist right on the edge of being fired where it's not worth firing you because you'd be hard to replace, but you're not really a good employee anyway. No one asks themselves these questions. And the goal here for you and I as employees would be the best employee we could be so that when we get moved out or moved up or transferred, our boss is like, dang, I'm going to miss that guy. I'm going to miss that gal. She was the best thing we ever had. Our department is going to be hurt when this person leaves. Now we're going to switch it over, and I want to talk about masters or bosses Verse 6 and verse 9, he addresses them in one passage. And you might say, that's kind of unfair. The first group, the employees, they get 3 verses, but the bosses only get 1 verse. That's because in the first section of verse 9, Paul says to the bosses, do the same. So everything I just said about all the employees, bosses, I want you to do the same thing. But then he goes on with a little bit more in verse 9. He says, I want you to stop threatening. It's easy when you're an employer, when you're in management, to lose your temper and to yell and to threaten. It's kind of like how you see people with their children in the grocery store or their dogs. No, you come here right now. I mean it right now. Okay, I'm serious this time. I'm going to give you the count to 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, I'm giving you one more count. 4. And they're still not listening, right? He says, this isn't how you manage people. This isn't leadership. You don't yell and you don't threaten and you don't get mad and you don't mistreat people. This is not how you lead. We know from business theory that really when it comes down to dealing with troublesome employees, you have 3 choices, and they call it the 3 R's. You redirect, you retrain, or you release. You don't have to get mad, though. Redirect means this employee is a pretty good employee, but the position they're in is not a good fit. And so we're going to redirect them to another area. I think if we take this employee and we put them over here, that they're going to do better. And so you redirect them. The other option is to retrain. That is, they're in this position and we like the employee, but he doesn't have the competency. We need to up his competency. And so we're going to retrain him. And then the final thing is you release them. It's not going to work. They're not trainable. They have character issues, so we let them go. So you redirect, you retrain, you release, but what we don't do is we don't yell and get mad and threaten and act like a dog owner who doesn't have any control over his dog. Paul says, stop threatening your employees. Verse 9. And then he brings a little bit of sobriety into this. He says, I want to remind you, employers, you have a master too. And the same master that is mastering your employee is mastering you as well, meaning you guys both serve Jesus Christ the Lord. One of the best demonstrations of a person's character is how they treat people under their power. And I believe that we ought to treat people with a certain level of sobriety because we're under the Lord's management as well. Back to Jocko Willink, he wrote a book called Extreme Ownership, and this is what he says. And this is a hard pill for leaders, managers, CEOs to swallow. His entire leadership theory is that you, the person in charge, have to take full responsibility. If your employees are causing trouble, that's on you. That's not on them. Every manager's going to, but you don't know what no. He says, no. You're the leader. It's on you. You need to redirect, retrain, or release. But you created the culture of this company, of this workplace. It is ultimately on you. And as a Navy SEAL, the way he brought people up the ranks and promoted them was on this issue, whether or not you could take responsibility for all of the people, the culture, and the climate of everyone underneath your command. It is on you, leaders. And ultimately, as leaders and managers, we must reflect upon our own work and our own competency and ask ourselves these questions. Why can't I keep employees? Why is my workplace out of control? Why are my employees doing these sorts of things? Because ultimately, it's on you, the leader. And this is one of the hardest things to hear when you're in leadership, and that is that people rarely quit jobs. They quit bosses. People don't usually quit jobs, they quit bosses. And when I look back at my career, there are jobs that I had that were temporary jobs, part-time jobs, and I quit them just because I was moving on. But there have been times in my life where I've had good, full-time, good paid jobs with medical benefits, and I have quit them, and I quit them because of my boss. What's the goal for you as a manager or a leader or a boss? Is for your employees to feel like this is the best place I've ever worked. I understand that you can't pay them all this money, but you can create an environment that's healthy. You can treat them well. You can treat all the employees well. And the idea would be that they're here and they're being offered another job, and the other job actually pays them more, and they say, I'm not going to take it because I just love working here so much because of the way the management treats me. And you'll find this. People will take less pay for a healthy environment. Back to lifeguarding, we had an incident once where at one of our facilities, we had a lake and a pool. And at a pool, we'd have, 200 people in this large pool. It was a lagoon and lots of little kids. And we had a policy there that if one of the lifeguards or any member of the public saw a floaty, a floaty in the pool, that we had to clear the pool. One of the lifeguards would get gloves on, go over there and grab that thing, put it in a bag, and then we would dump bleach on the spot, which didn't do any good. It just looked good in front of the public. And then everyone had to stay out of the pool for a half hour. Okay? So this was the policy. But the other policy was, because a lot of little kids, right? The other policy is that if it's not solid and it comes out as liquid brown, the pool was closed for the day. We pulled everyone out, shut down the pool. Which no one wanted to do because you'd have 12 lifeguards, the people at the gate, park rangers. There was about 20 people who were working and getting hours. And if a little kid had a mess in the pool, then everyone went home that day. Well, we had an employee. Didn't want to work. So he took it upon himself, and I have first-hand information on this. Took it upon himself to go into the restroom and drop a bomb in a plastic bag. Then during his break to go swim in the pool and to release it and then be like, hey, we got a situation here. And then they cleared the pool and sent everyone home. And then he got to go home and have the day off. As far as we know, he did it a couple of times. I remember I was in the room when my manager called his manager to tell him what was going on. And the manager, the uppers, they could not believe, they thought it was a joke. We later referred to it as the Brownwater investigation. But this is the sort of mess that we have to deal with in our workplaces. From idiotic employees to jerk bosses. And Paul says, it's not so with you guys. Employees, you are going to work for your boss as if you're working for Jesus. Employers, you're going to treat your employees how you would treat Jesus. Christians, we've got to come together and create healthy workplaces, and I want you to work as unto the Lord. Don't be like the people out there. We're different. We're set apart. We're holy. We've been empowered by the Holy Spirit. So let's go out there and change the world through our conduct. And when they see our conduct, they might just believe our message. But at the end of the day, we can't do anything without the power of Christ. And so our first step in every situation is to abandon ourselves, confess Christ as Lord, follow Him, and allow the Holy Spirit to work in our lives so that we can have power to do good.